we have access on a daily basis to senior leaders and to, I guess, influential decision makers who can make changes in the hiring structure and what they're doing.
Over the last couple of years, we've made sure that as a business, our culture and the service that we offer is a representation of what we want to see in society. So we will be talking to these senior leaders about some of the challenges and getting into detail around some of the initiatives that have been successful and worked for them.
What we really would like to do is kind of normalise the conversation and get people comfortable with having conversations around diversity and inclusion.
Today we've got the amazing Sarah-Emily Oades, who is an amazing TA leader that has worked across some of the coolest companies globally. I've been speaking to Sarah about this topic for a while now, and she's super passionate about all things DE&I. So I'll leave it to Sarah to introduce herself.
All right. Hi, I'm a recovering lawyer, which is what I often refer to myself as, turned TA person. I have been in talent now for about 12 years, and I moved in-house about 11 and a half years ago, so I didn't last long on the agency side. It wasn't for me. But I have had the privilege of working with some really cool startups and scale-ups, and I'd love to just share a little bit more about some of the work that we've been doing.
Perfect. So like I say, we've obviously had quite a few conversations around the whole DE&I piece. Obviously, you work at companies that are typically growing and growing quickly, which sometimes may take away from that focus, if you like, and it's easy to kind of overlook the fact that you're not hiring diverse talent and looking at DE&I across the board when trying to scale quite quickly. But to kick us off, I guess, let's talk about the post-pandemic and how you found attracting and hiring talent post-pandemic, certainly with the DE&I focus in mind.
I don't know if we are quite post-pandemic just yet,
yeah,
to be honest, given that they only indoors today. But I certainly think so throughout the pandemic, it has actually given rise to a fair amount of opportunity if people have taken it. So certainly a couple of the companies that I worked for through the really like the depths of the pandemic and lockdowns actually opened up more to remote workers and people like that. And so that in itself created more access for perhaps more diverse socioeconomic groups, or geolocational elements were also no longer an issue. So just because you don't live in a city doesn't mean that you can't get a job at this company. So Zigo is a great example here. We actually hired a ton of people fully remote in as far up as Scotland, as far south as sort of Bath, and further into Wiltshire and Somerset. And so I think actually for throughout the pandemic, it gave opportunity where people took it. And I think that's the operative phrase, is where people took advantage of it. I think certainly post-pandemic, again, I think it really depends on the attitudes of the company, right? So the company that I currently work for have pretty spaced out offices, but also a very genuinely open mindset when it comes to where they find their talent. You know, the best talent isn't necessarily going to be close to HQ in Berlin. It might not be around the other offices. Maybe we hire a couple of people in the Middle East, actually, as we have done over the last couple of months. And so I think for that reason, it's given rise to, with the right attitude and the buy-in from leadership, more opportunity for groups that would not have been considered, as I said earlier, on the basis of geolocational variance or sort of their socioeconomic group and therefore location that is connected with that. So I do think, and I'll say this again, for people that have taken advantage of that or have taken advantage of the opportunity that presents, it's actually really opened up this new level of D&I that wasn't being considered before, or they didn't have access to before. But I know that there are companies that also don't feel the same way and don't want to hire remote and really want to come fully back into the office. We're seeing this mainly within banking, of course, which is what we would expect due to various issues related to that industry. But I do think it's kind of a bit of a trick that might be missed by some people by having, we must return to office.
Yeah. And so you're obviously working at a forward-thinking company now. You've worked at forward-thinking companies in the past. So let's just, I guess, take a step back and say that you're not working at a forward-thinking company who are happy to start kind of looking at different locations and utilize the fact that they can hire all over the place, which in turn, like you said, then open up the door to different socioeconomic groups and ethnicities and so on and so forth. But if you were attracting talent for your office-based roles in, let's say, your office in Berlin or London, what type of focus do you have, and how do you go about implementing that focus from a DE&I perspective?
So that being the case, I certainly think it's about giving access to these groups. So that's when I think you're looking at your sourcing strategies. Perhaps you implement a sourcing window whereby you target specific groups in your reach outs in order to be able to give them kind of an equal representation at the top of your recruiting funnel. It will also mean augmenting your actual recruiting process to be equally as representative of the sample of people that you're trying to put through your funnel as well. For example, you can't just have all white men interview a diverse group of people, because that doesn't land. I've had personal experiences where I've interviewed with companies and I've been interviewed by all men. And I find that quite, well, to be honest, sad, because I don't think there's any need for that. I think you should showcase, even if you don't have a huge amount of diversity, you should showcase it and give access to that within your interviewing panel. Because it can really put people off, and I can only speak for myself as a woman, but I can only imagine that people from perhaps the BAME community also don't want to be interviewed by just all white people. I can imagine that to be the same for them too. They want to see themselves reflected, or they want to see themselves represented at that company as well. And so I think this is where you really have to look at, I suppose, the entire journey that the candidate has with your company, but also how do you get them to even talk to you in the first place. This is the part that I think a lot of companies are quite nervous about, because they think it will increase their cost, or they think it will increase their time to hire, or all these other myths, and they are myths that people tend to throw along with this. Of course, there are markets where it's more difficult. I do understand that. But I know from personal experience that you can both increase the representation you have within your teams while cutting your time to hire pretty significantly. And my team at Zego, within the tech, so which included back then product and engineering, they managed to increase their reputation from the sub 20th percentile to 38% for engineering alone of female representation. They also took BAME representation from under 17% to just over 30% in 5 months, and also cut the time to hire significantly. So sort of the late teens. It's a few months ago now, but that was the status back then. So I know it can be done. And I think by taking those kinds of numbers, and that's ultimately what you as a hiring manager care about. If you're a head of engineering or CTO, you want to know that your projects are going to be executed on in a timely fashion. You want to know that the planning that you have done is actually also going to be able to be delivered, because that will affect your business success. So what you don't want is then somebody bringing you an initiative where you're not entirely bought in, because you think it's going to delay your team and your team's ability to be successful, which obviously they don't want. But like I say, it's been proven that from my personal experience, and I had a wonderful team, but by no means are they the only people that can achieve this, right? And so you can achieve both a reduction in time to hire and also increasing your diversity, especially in roles like this. I think it's even more important, because again, there is not the access, I suppose, at the beginning of the education required for all of the underrepresented groups. And we haven't even gone into neurodiversity or any other aspects of diversity either. So I really think that's an important piece to remember, is that if you give access earlier in the stages, if you're really making sure that your job descriptions are representative of who you are, they're not sort of very, very gendered in the use of language, that you're making sure you're representative on multiple platforms, and that you're giving access to the groups that wouldn't naturally come to you, then I think you're headed in the right direction.
Okay. And in terms of, so obviously you mentioned the bit around pace, and these hires are sometimes business critical. So as you said, you might not always get buy-in from the senior stakeholders, because they need these people, and they need them quickly. How important then does pipelining become, and what methods are you aware of, or what methods have you used to make sure that from a pipeline perspective, it does kind of represent where you want to go in terms of your DE&I culture?
Yeah, I think this is where it's really important to have that close connection between your TA team be it internal, external, or otherwise,
Yeah.
and your business planning. So if a hiring manager comes to me today, knowing that our time to hire is 55 days and tells me, hey, I need 18 people before the end of next quarter, that's problematic. Purely from a mathematical perspective, that's really problematic, right? So I think this is where having that connection to the business, having a seat at the table, asking the right questions, and being very comfortable having somewhat difficult conversations. And these conversations are not easy for everybody. If any, at all. And I think if we can stay connected to the business in that way, then you can prepare better. And this is where pipelining is super important. So it's having as much advance notice as possible. It's making sure that you understand what the intricacies are of all their different requirements. And then to make sure that your team, be it TA or sourcing, is ready to source these people so that we have more time to get them ahead of time. Because of course, there's only so much you can solve with a 2-week sourcing window. You're not going to hire, if you have 2 TAs, 30 odd developers at the end of a 3-week stint. That's not going to happen. You're going to hire more like, I think in our highest stint, we hired something like 8 or 9 developers out of 1 sprint, which was great. But that was still with a bit of advance notice. So I think it's really important to make sure that you're in touch with your business, you're actively pipelining, but that you're also engaging in your pipeline. I think sometimes there's always this, or there's almost rather, this tendency to just sort of chuck people that meet certain requirements into this list. And then you don't really do anything with it until you think you need it. But these connections need to be maintained, and they need to be developed. And the way to do that is to make sure that you're using either a CRM tool, or there's also various pieces that you can use within ATS to make sure that you're giving content to these guys that's interesting. You could have an engineering blog that you share with them. Oh, did you see we posted this? Or do you make sure that you're baking this into your employer branding strategy, that they are being almost courted, right? So they understand a bit more about the company before they're even in the actual active pipeline. And that's often something that I've sought to build during my time, certainly over the last couple of companies, where sourcing has very much been a much bigger part of my role. It's then making sure that we're also maintaining this group of people. Pandemic has made that very difficult, because when we all invite people in, then you'll introduce them to your engineering team, and you would hold hackathons, and all of these things are a little bit more difficult when you're not allowed to be in a room with more than 2 people, right? So trying to go online with that piece has also had its own challenges, I'm sure, for everybody. Certainly that's always worked well for us, but you have to build relationships with your business, because without the knowledge, you can't prepare.
Okay.
That's key for us.
And you mentioned the when you hired the kind of 8 or 9 developers there, so that kind of leads well into the next question, I guess, which is a pretty big thing at the moment as far as diversity across certain disciplines. So let's just take companies out of it completely and just talk about, I don't know, the diversity element within technology as a whole. So how are you tackling kind of diversity within tech?
So this is a really interesting one. So we've split our overall tech function, which includes product as well as core engineering and data. We've split that into, 3 categories that are non-managerial, let's say. So we have early careers, mid-careers, and then sort of your principal level, as it were. And so for the early careers, we're actually working with people who, bearing in mind this is the German market, but in the German market specifically, we're working with they're non-school leavers. It's a little bit like an apprenticeship. And so we're working with them to make sure that we're giving access to people who either didn't have the time, or for whatever restraints were not able to go to university and go that route. So they've done this apprenticeship, right? In German, it's called the Fachhochschule, which is like a real mouthful, but essentially it's like a technical school. And so then we take them from there, and we pop them into sort of the more junior end roles, and making sure that we're not just pinching this diversity from a bunch of other companies, which is of course part of what everybody has to do. In order to continue to nurture that level of diversity within the industry, you also have to make sure that you're giving access to people who are not at the top of that food chain, but rather sort of the next generation of tech. And this is something that Zego did really well as well. They worked with an organization in the UK who sort of retrained people, put them on these various courses, and then place them with companies who then, if they needed additional modules of technology, they would send them kind of back to this school and then bring them back once they had completed the various assignments. And I think pieces like that have worked really, really well, because it's not enough to just hire the existing diversity. You have to make sure that there is a space and that you're nurturing sort of up and coming diversity as well. And that with itself has also brought with increased awareness of not just the access for BAME and females, but also or women rather, but also those with neurodiversity or more of a socioeconomic barrier perhaps to their prior entry into this line of work. And I think that really sets the right tone for coming next as well. And sort of, well, what does this look like in 5 years' time? Well, a lot better than what it does right now. But again, that does rely on a broader set of people taking advantage of these programs. But I've been a big believer in them. I've really seen them work. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how this continues to work with a slight adaptation specific to the German market, upon which we're working heavily at the moment.
Okay. And have you seen a value add already in terms of branding, in terms of brand awareness, in terms of how candidates and potential candidates kind of look at your brand or some of the companies that you work for, their overall brand? Have you seen the benefits of that by kind of these programs and outreaches and so on and so forth, and just increasing your footprint, certainly? Like you say, you mentioned on a number of occasions access, which obviously increases visibility, so people are a lot more aware of the companies and what the companies are doing. Have you seen the value add in terms of attracting diverse talent off the back of that?
I would say that if I take the last couple of companies that I've worked for, one is within the insurance sector and another is within the medical sector. Both very, to use a very PC term, both very traditional industries. So internally, we've really seen the value add of some of the programs that we're taking, people straight out of school or school leavers, or we haven't publicized in those two companies what we're doing there. And I quite like that that's not being used as a PR tool, because that's the other piece, the other side of diversity, is I think a lot of people like to talk diversity, but taking action isn't necessarily something that everybody likes to do. Now, what I will say is, in terms of creating access with respect to really publicizing more about how inclusive we are as a culture, or how we've learned from our mistakes, which is also a really, really big deal. And I think that that kind of humility as an organization is very important. And that's something I see in AMBOSS. They're just a very real, they want to be honest. And so they've seen things like the pay gap was addressed recently in a post that we made. The pay gap has become a much bigger topic within the German market over the last 18 months. And we actively addressed how we were in the pay gap. And that really, we ended up with mixed responses, but and it has come up in conversations that we've had since. And so I really do think that sharing learnings is really quite impactful. And so then you start getting referrals, and obviously as you bring more of a representative sample of the population in, you also end up with more referrals that are also more representative of that sample. So this is a really long answer to actually what could have been a very short response. So yes, for some things where we felt that it was right to talk about it, but the objective was never just to do it for the sake of doing it. So it was never just for the PR. And so some of the pieces that I've done, certainly with the last two companies, we haven't even talked about publicly. But certainly there's been really great responses to when we did hit, for example, our milestone of 38% female representation in engineering and 30% BAME representation in engineering. We definitely made posts about that at Zego, and we got some great response, and that was, it was exciting for us, it was exciting for the team, and that definitely, it did generate sort of more interest from groups that prior had not been. So I think it can, but I think it's just very, very important to not overdo the PR for the PR's sake. Right. And just paying lip service to it simply doesn't suffice. Yeah,
totally agree. And how have you managed to kind of implement that culture into your teams, if you like? Because obviously I know we've spoken about it on a number of occasions. I know how passionate you are about it, and obviously you'll take accountability as an individual and make the impact that you can have, certainly. But how have you how have you kind of implemented that thought process across the board? And I'm assuming that obviously starts with your team.
Well, actually, it starts with leadership. So it started with my leadership team first, and it's I think with them, it's often really we focus on the education element of it. So, did you know this? Did you know? With respect to the pay gap, for example, that came up, and so I referenced something that actually I referenced a couple of months ago now in another podcast I did. But the Fawcett Society did this incredible study on how people in general feel about the workplace, the pay gap post-pandemic, and the findings are really quite shocking. So the fact that women of my age bracket, mid-30s. Generally, will not see equal pay in our lifetime with the men that hold the same roles, right? And so, and sort of something like 37% of white women are very nervous about what post-pandemic brings in terms of career opportunities or essentially stunting of career growth because of the economic impact of the pandemic. But when you compare that with 50% of BAME women, that puts a whole new lens on the whole piece, right? So I think I just think it's very important to remember the impact on different groups of these kinds of attitudes. Anyway, sorry, I've gone really, really off topic.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
It's sort of topic adjacent, right? So, but anyway, let's go back to your actual question. I'll get to the point on that.
Yeah, no, listen, and this is why these conversations are so good, right? Because, and I think we've touched on it so many times that we could speak for hours about so many different elements and yeah, we could literally sit here for 2 hours. Obviously, we're not going to. But yeah, I mean, I guess the reason why I asked just around the team side of things is because I think sometimes where people might not understand, like you say, the education piece, and some people are nervous to talk about things that are around DEI. I think people obviously have to get comfortable having uncomfortable conversations, but also I don't think the conversation always has to be uncomfortable. I think there's a stigma around DEI that every conversation will end up being an uncomfortable conversation. It will be an honest conversation, but that doesn't necessarily have to be uncomfortable. So how, again, going back to it, I guess, in terms of your team, being the senior leader that you are, how have you kind of embedded or implemented, like I say, just a shift in thought process around hiring and attracting talent?
And sorry to cut you off, but it's not always had to be a shift, which I'm very lucky, because I've had very diverse teams. My current team is 8 people with 8 different nationalities, and it's so cool to me to have that. So actually diversity and the education for my team specifically hasn't always had to be there. They just haven't always known where to start. And that's something that I've encountered where I am now. And sometimes the achievements that they've had have been accidental rather than intentional, which is also great because then you have a really solid foundation to build on. At Zigo, it was really interesting. So I actually had, and I won't name names because I don't want to embarrass him, but there was a chap on my team who was very comfortable making impact and kind of helping in any way he could. But when I suggested perhaps he lead the D&I case study that we had for 3 months, he said, well, I'm not really sure I'm the right person to do that. As a white man, I'm not affected by any of this. I said, okay, that's an interesting take. I said, but perhaps you would consider how you would position yourself as an ally instead of considering, well, I'm not part of that group, so I don't know what to do for them. I'm not part of many of the groups. My only addition is that I'm a woman, but, I think I have a certain level of access myself that enables me to be an ally for the multiple groups that I try to make sure have representation. And so I haven't had to do a huge amount of education with my own teams. The sticking point has often been actually senior leadership, and that's not because they don't care, it's because they don't understand and they're not comfortable not understanding. And so how do you have this conversation to make them more comfortable having that conversation in future? But that's the only incident I've had over the last couple of years where D&I has been a big focus in my role, where I've had to kind of reposition how somebody thinks about it. And he absolutely crushed it. Like, he is responsible for the statistics that I mentioned earlier. And I'm sure they're in a better place even now, because it's now 3 months since I've left. And so, so I've never had to. I think it's been a lot about kind of framing and helping people figure out where to start. But creating the energy or interest in the first place has never been a problem. And I realize that makes me privileged in my own right, because that's also not always the case. But I've been really very lucky and very proud to work with people who are already aware of some of these things, but perhaps they want to figure out the correct terms to use, or the correct language to use, or who would I talk to about this, or how do we make this more inclusive, or you know, look at our interview panels, where do you think we could take additional people from? So I'm always there for guidance, but the kind of innate drive to do better has very spoiled as a leader. Very spoiled.
Sure. Okay, brilliant. And what's the most important thing you've learnt over the last, I'd say, kind of like 5 or 6 years? Like we touched upon at the start, you've worked for some fantastic companies that are growing rapidly. So I can only imagine the pressure, and we've obviously already touched upon the fact that how do you kind of keep that DE&I focus whilst going through that hyper growth. But what would you say the most important thing you've learned on your journey as a takeaway for those that are listening?
That's a really tough one. Am I allowed a top 3? And then people can choose.
For sure.
Okay. So 1, always be open to learning more. You know, I think I have had many revelations along my interest of D&I. I thought I was doing the right thing, and I was maybe not using quite the right language, or but there's no room for ego in this. You just have to accept it and be willing to be continually educated by those around you. Secondly, really big one, buy-in. And that doesn't always mean lots of money. I think a lot of people think, oh, you know, if I want to make my job descriptions more inclusive, then Textio is my only option. No shade on Textio, but truthfully, I've worked for a lot of startups over the last couple of years, and we just don't have that kind of income to be able to support that. But there are so many other products that offer something really similar. So cost just shouldn't be an issue. So buy-in from your leadership team, making sure that they are really committed to doing things properly is also super important. And the last piece is dispel the myth. That's my first go-to with a lot of things, is when people say, oh no, we're really worried because this is going to add lots to our time to hire, or you know, it's not going to make a real impact. And that's where you really have to counteract it by dispelling that myth that creating a more diverse team, or creating access to people to even have the potential for a more diverse team, does not mean that your time to hire is suddenly going to explode. That's not accurate. You can actually reduce your time to hire, as well as, with good planning, as well as create a more diverse place to work for everybody, bring in more diverse talent, and also have a better, more diverse thought-led team. And that, I think, is a key part to also business success, because if you have a developer team that all think the same, there's many examples in technology where they haven't considered, for example, there was a fitness app that hadn't considered women's menstrual cycle, which is kind of important if you're thinking about a fitness and wellness app, because all the developers were men, so that it never came into it. There's a well-known phone manufacturer who had only had right-handed people, so they didn't consider that left-handed people would cover the speaker when they held the phone. There's like diversity of thought, and that's like the most basic examples, but diversity of thought is so important. And so dispelling the myth to get people onto the bandwagon, whatever it looks like, is really important. So there's my top 3. Pick whichever one you think is most important.
Brilliant.
I can just choose one. So
brilliant. And listen, there's definitely some really good options there, some great insight across the whole conversation, in all honesty. And like I say, obviously we've had a number of conversations around it, so I know you're actively kind of championing and you're an active kind of ally, if you like, that you mentioned it a few times, for all things DE&I. So I'm sure there's some really good takeaways there for people to listen to, and try and kind of shift or implement new things within their own businesses and organizations, and also take accountability, right, as individuals, which I think is where the journey starts, for sure. But before I let you go, Keeping with our theme of DE&I bucket list, what is on your bucket list in general?
My general bucket list, well, to travel at all is kind of on my current bucket list.
Sure.
That is for everyone. That's such a terrible answer. No, so truthfully, my next big trip is going to be going to Seoul, hopefully for New Year's Eve with a group of friends. I'm so excited. I've been wanting to go. This trip has been on hold for about 2 years now. That's the next big thing on my bucket list. There's a really, really long list, but I won't bore you with that.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the next big thing for me.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, listen, I hope you get to do it. And thank you so much for being such an excellent guest.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. My absolute pleasure.